This video goes into detail of human vertebrae osteology, the study of bone of the vertebral column. If you want the brief tutorial, please see the previous video in the link below. There's also a quiz to follow linked in the description. Let's get started. This is a list of structures that are common to most all typical vertebrae. We'll identify them first and then go into more detail on each region of the spine. Starting with the vertebral body, it's the more anterior portion and it's the primary weight-bearing part. They are oval-shaped in the cervical spine, heart-shaped in the thoracic spine, and more kidney-shaped in the lumbar spine. Note that they do gradually get larger the further downward you go in the spine because they are bearing more weight. The vertebral arch is the posterior part, and it's comprised of two pedicles. They are right here on each side, connecting to the vertebral bodies. Then connected to that are the laminae. They are right here. And together, in the middle, we have this hole or foramen that's formed called the vertebral foramen. It is more triangular for most of the cervical spine. In the thoracic, it's round or circular. In the lumbar, it is triangular shaped. That vertebral foramen is going to transmit the spinal cord through most of the spine and then transition the cauda equina around L1 or L2 downward. Now, a side view will help us better visualize the next couple landmarks that are actually part of the pedicles. Here we have a couple of lumbar vertebrae that are stacked on top of each other. This right here is an inferior vertebral notch, and this right here is a superior vertebral notch. Notice the names. So if we're referring to this vertebrae, the inferior notch is right here while it has a superior notch above. And in reference to this vertebra, we have a superior notch here because there's an inferior notch here. So together, these notches are going to help form intervertebral foramen right here, which transmit spinal nerves. The next group I have labeled as vertebral processes, and these are actually part of the vertebral arch. They're just extensions of them. Now there's going to be a single spinous process at the junction of the lamellae. In the cervical spine, they're bifid or forked. In the thoracic, they are long and pointy. And in the lumbar spine, they're hatchet-shaped. Then we have four articular processes. They're going to be two superior and two on the inferior side. And we're not going to see the inferior ones on these particular views, but we'll see them in future slides. Now on each of those articular processes is going to be a facet. So there's going to be four articular facets. We're only going to see two on each of these on the superior side. And they're sometimes shiny and they allow for gliding and movement. Then we have transverse processes. And there's going to be two, one on the left and one on the right. And there's a bit more going on with each of these transverse processes in all three of the regions of the spine. So we'll look at them individually. So let's start with the cervical vertebrae. Typical cervical vertebrae refers to C3 through C7. C1 and C2 are atypical vertebrae, and we'll look at those later. Now that we have an inferior view of a typical cervical vertebrae, we can actually see the inferior articular processes, more specifically really just the facets from this particular view. So the spinous processes are going to be bifid or bifurcated, and that basically means that they're forked. Now other than C7, and also there are individual variations that do exist, so normally atypical ones are bifurcated except for C7. The transverse processes, they actually have a fairly odd looking shape to them right here. Now the true transverse process originates from the lamina and the pedicle right here, and we can actually consider that the posterior tubercle, whereas the costal element right here arises right there, right around the body, and it's equivalent to a thoracic rib developmentally, and do note that sometimes these can develop into extracervical ribs. You can get a little bit more specific and consider the posterior portion right here, the posterior tubercle, whereas the costal element can be referred to as the anterior tubercle. So between all of that, between the transverse processes, as well as the pedicle and the body right here, in the cervical region, we have transverse foramina, one on each side. And normally, they all carry the vertebral artery and the vertebral vein, except for C7 typically only carries the vertebral vein. Do note that individual variations do exist. The vertebral foramen is triangular shaped, and then the vertebral body itself is overall oval shaped. Lastly, we have uncinate processes right here. And if you look at it from more of an anterior view, you can see it right there and there. Overall, it gives this a U shape when viewing from the front. And on each side, they form uncovertebral joints. And basically, they help stabilize the neck, limiting lateral flexion and allowing for more flexion and extension. C1 and C2 are referred to as atypical vertebrae, and they look a lot different than the others. C1 is also known as the Atlas, named after the Greek titan that was depicted by having to hold up the round sky or heavens for all eternity. And in anatomy, the Atlas, C1, is tasked with holding up none other than the skull, which is like a round sphere. The occipital bone can also be sometimes referred to as C0, denoted by having held up by C1, the Atlas. So this is C1 right here, and CO, or the occiput, would sit right on top of that. C1 lacks a vertebral body, so we can remove that from the list. The vertebral arch is a bit different, and we'll cover that, but there are no true pedicles nor laminae, so we can remove those from the list. It doesn't have a true spinous process, so we can cross that off. Now, it does have transverse processes, and those are right here. And note that it also does have those transverse foramina off to each side, characteristic of cervical vertebrae. There is a large vertebral foramen here in the middle. And the articular processes and facets are considerably different in morphology, so we'll just refer to those as the articular surfaces. But do note from the superior view, look at the shape of these compared to the inferior view. On the superior view, they're more concave, whereas the inferior view, they're flattened. So that's how you can tell the difference between the superior and inferior surfaces. C1 is one large ring-like structure, so we'll divide it into 4 different regions. Instead of having a vertebral body and a vertebral arch, C1 has an anterior arch as well as a posterior arch. And it also has what are known as lateral masses off to each side. So together those structures form one ring-like structure with a vertebral foramen here in the middle. The lateral masses each have a superior as well as our inferior articular facets. On the inferior surface, they're flattened and they articulate with C2 below. On the superior surface, they're more concave and they articulate with CO, part of the skull, the occiput. The transverse ligament tubercles are part of the lateral masses on each side. And if we bring up this diagram, we can see C1 sitting on top of C2. That structure right there is the dens, so we'll place it right here. And what those tubercles do, essentially they provide an anchor point right here, and they serve as anchor points for none other than the transverse ligament of the atlas. And what that does is it basically secures the dens in place and allows for rotation of C1 on top of C2. The anterior arch has an anterior tubercle, and while it's not in perfect view here or here, it will be located roughly there. And it serves as an attachment point for the longus colli muscle as well as the anterior longitudinal ligament. There's also a facet for the dens, located right here, which articulates with none other than the dens or odontoid process and allows for smooth rotation. The posterior arch has a posterior tubercle, and it serves as the attachment point for the nuchal ligament as well as the suboccipital muscles, at least some of them. Then they have a smooth surface right here on both sides. That is the groove for the vertebral artery. So the vertebral artery is going to pass through the transverse foramen, run through and over that groove for the vertebral artery, pass through the atlanto-occipital membrane, and deliver blood, very vital blood, to the brain going upward. And this is going to happen bilaterally. So even given the uniqueness of this atypical cervical vertebra, just note that it has the 3 foramen that's characteristic to all cervical vertebrae. C2 is our other atypical cervical vertebra, and it's more similar to other cervical vertebrae, so it has all of the similar components to it. One part in addition to this list that's much different from the others is the dens right here. And so during development, part of the C1 sclerotome essentially migrates away from and joins part of the C2 sclerotome and later fuses together with it, becoming part of C2. So if you think about it, this dens right here, that kind of was supposed to have been the body for C1, but C2 basically stole it from C1. So that's what we're going to focus our attention with on C2 is the dens. But do know that these structures over here, they're mostly similar to typical cervical vertebrae. The dens is also known as the odontoid process, and it has an anterior articular facet right there, as well as a posterior articular facet, posteriorly obviously. The posterior facet is not going to be quite as apparent as the anterior facet. So anteriorly, the dens or odontoid process is going to articulate with C1, specifically at the facet for the dens of C1. Posteriorly, we're going to have this ligament going behind it. It's basically wrapping it around and holding the dens in place. This ligament is the transverse ligament of the atlas. So all of that secures it in place. So structurally, this is going to allow for most of cervical spine rotation at this pivot point. And if you think about mathematics, like a graph with an x and y axis, therefore we get our name because this axis is our point of reference in which we get most of our rotation of the cervical spine. So ultimately, everything in anatomy and nomenclature makes sense once you understand both form and function of it. Thoracic vertebrae are very straightforward, and we have identified most of these parts in the first slide, but now we have an inferior view of a thoracic vertebra. We can see we have the inferior articular facets both here and here. Now, students will find this one really easy to identify when looking at it from behind, in that it kind of looks like the head of a giraffe. Whereas the spinous process is the long nose, the transverse processes are like the ears, and the superior articular processes and facets are kind of like the horns, which really aren't actually horns, they're cartilaginous structures in giraffes. Thoracic vertebrae basically have all the standard features. The main difference being is that these are located in the thorax and they serve as attachment points for the ribs. The rib heads have a direct attachment point to the thoracic vertebrae. Laterally, specifically on the vertebral bodies, they articulate with costal facets. Now, these are plastic models, so you can't really appreciate them all that well, but they are there, and we'll color them in shortly. Now, do note that over here, there's a shared articulation point between the upper and lower. These are going to be referred to as demifacets. That's because one rib head sits right here and articulates with both the upper and lower facet. We will see full costal facets of the upper rib for T1 as well as T11 and T12, but we'll come back to both of those. Now, the thoracic vertebrae do also have articulations with the transverse costal facets laterally on none other than transverse processes, and these are a little bit easier to see on the plastic models. But do notice how there's only one facet per transverse process, unlike cases of the demifacets. Now we're looking at a close-up lateral view of T11 as well as T12. Notice how there's only a single facet on each side of the vertebral body. That is because T11 and T12 ribs only articulate with a single vertebral body. We'll color these in red, so they are full costal facets. Also notice the shape and size of the transverse processes. As we're going downward in the thoracic spine, they're getting smaller, and notice that I do not have transverse costal facets on them. That's because T11 and T12 ribs are floating ribs, thus they do not articulate with the transverse processes. Note that T1 does have a complete upper costal facet, while the lower one is a demifacet. So other than that, the unique features of the thoracic vertebrae include vertebral bodies that are heart-shaped, vertebral foramen that are circular and relative to other parts of the spine are a bit smaller, and lastly, the spinous processes are rather long and pointy, but a lot of students just like to look at the back of these thoracic vertebrae and look for the giraffe. Now moving on to the lumbar spine. Again, here are the common parts to most all vertebrae, and we've identified them all in the very first slide. The only thing in addition to those is now we have an inferior view, and you can see the inferior articular processes and the inferior articular facets, the smooth shiny part. To identify this as a lumbar vertebra, most students just like to look at the very back of the vertebra and look and see what appears to be a moose or a deer head. In that, the spinous process is the long nose, the transverse processes are kind of like the ears, and the superior articular processes and facets are like the antlers. So that's an easy way to identify it. And then here are the unique features of lumbar vertebra to be able to identify them in another way. We have an overall kidney-shaped vertebral body, a hatchet-shaped spinous process, and then a triangular-shaped vertebral foramen. Now let's look at an oblique view of the lumbar vertebra. On a lumbar x-ray, specifically an oblique view, it's basically a 45-degree rotated view of the spine in which we're looking at a three-dimensional vertebra and it's superimposed over itself, creating a flat 2D image. What we're looking for is a Scottish Terrier dog with a dense fur undercoat, commonly referred to as a Scotty dog. Here we see overall the head of the dog, where the nose is the transverse process, the ears are the superior articular process, and the eye, you really can't see it, but remember, with x-rays, we're taking a three-dimensional image and turning it into 2D because we're seeing what's behind it. That's going to actually be the pedicle. Here we're seeing the tail from a superior articular process, the body of the dog as the spinous process and the lamina, and then the foreleg and the hind leg are both of the inferior articular processes. Note that you can't really see a whole lot of it right here, and I have this rotated a little bit differently because we can see a couple of other objects a little bit better, but that's our Scotty dog. So the pars interarticularis is going to be the neck of the dog. Now what its name implies, pars meaning apart, inter is going to be between, articularis refers to the articular processes. So the pars interarticularis is this bridge between both of the articular processes. And it's a rather weak spot. It's actually the weakest spot of the lumbar vertebral arch, and it's prone to fracture. So on an x-ray, a radiologist will be looking at this image to make sure the Scotty dog neck is intact, because it's a very common spot where fractures can occur. And then the lumbar vertebrae have a couple of unique processes. Our mammillary processes, those are right here in green. These are rounded projections just behind the superior articular processes, and they serve as attachment points for the multifidus muscles. They're deep core stabilizing muscles, and they're rather important. Mammillary processes can sometimes also be observed in the lower thoracic vertebra as well. The accessory processes, those are right here in purple. These are actually a part of the transverse processes, and they are actually attached close to the superior articular processes. They're another anchor for some additional deep back muscles. Unlike the rest of the vertebra thus far, the sacrum does not have most of the parts that are common to other vertebrae. They're a bit more modified. The sacrum is basically going to be 5 different vertebrae that are fused together, S1 through S5. They can be abbreviated that way, and note how the lower you go, it gives this overall this wedge-like shape to the sacrum. So starting with regions or surfaces, the top right here is considered the base. The very bottom is the apex, which articulates with the coccyx. Then laterally over here, we have 2 large articular surfaces that are attached to the os coxae, which are also commonly known as the hip bones. Together with the 2 hip bones in the sacrum, collectively they form what's referred to as the pelvis. The front can be referred to as the pelvic surface, and the back can be referred to as the dorsal surface. Now focusing on the region of the base of the sacrum, it's going to articulate L5 above via the superior articular processes as well as the facets. They're going to articulate the L5 inferior articular process and facets. The sacral promontory is this anterior ridge, and it's an important landmark used to separate the greater from the lesser pelvis, as well as a good landmark for obstetrics. On top, we have the lumbosacral surface for the L5-S1 disc. And then off to the sides, we have the sacral ala or ala, which can also be called the sacral wings. And they are large, and they help provide stability by anchoring the spine to the pelvis. Because the sacrum is technically 5 fused vertebrae, the common structures for all vertebrae are basically the same structures with different names. For example, the vertebral foramen is simply renamed the sacral canal, but do note that the distal end of it is renamed the sacral hiatus, and it transmits what is left of what was formerly the spinal cord, basically the 5th sacral nerves, coccygeal nerves, and the filum terminale. Now it is a canal because it goes all the way from S1 all the way to S5 when it transitions to the sacral hiatus. The sacral cornu are off to the side as well. They're the horns that help guard the entrance or the exit to the sacral hiatus. The transverse lines here are basically fused discs, and they fuse typically in late adolescence, early adulthood. And so when they fuse, we consider them remnant discs or transverse lines. Now here the intervertebral foramen, abbreviated IVF, are basically the same thing in the sacrum, but we have to distinguish between the anterior as well as the posterior sacral foramina. These spinous processes are basically all fused together, creating the median sacral crest. Same thing with the articular processes, all fused together, creating the intermediate sacral crests. There's two of them. And in the transverse processes, same thing, fused together, creating the lateral sacral crests. Lastly, we have the sacral tuberosity, which is a roughened region that serves as an attachment point for some sacroiliac ligaments. And finally, the very last bone or vertebra, the coccyx, which is generally 3 to 5 fused coccygeal vertebrae. And just like the sacrum, overall it has this wedge-like shape to it, with the base at the top and the narrower apex at the bottom. There are 2 cornea, or cornu, singular, and these are horn-like projections, just like in the sacrum. And they are located on the posterior aspect, while we have our transverse processes off to each side, be viewed anteriorly and posteriorly. And that will conclude our video on vertebrae osteology, osteology being the study of bones. In our next video will be a practice quiz in which you'll be able to identify the bone types or names as well as the individual landmarks and test your knowledge.